Alright everybody, so about a month ago I had a video about how Brighter Shores launch is going and why I think a lot of people were being way too critical of it. Now, it has been a little over a month. I signed up for the monthly subscription and it renewed recently. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how it's been going. So of course, if you have not played the game or if you've not seen my prior video about the game, chances are you probably won't really understand what I am talking about here, so maybe you'll want to go back and do that. I also have to apologize in advance. The footage that I'm using, as you can see, is me playing RuneScape and Brighter Shores at the same time because that is how I roll. You are going to have to deal with it. I'm also going to apologize because it turns out that my internet was acting up really badly at the time that I was filming. And so, of course, this results in some disconnects and some issues later on in the video. But that said, I want to get into a little bit about how the game has changed in the month and a half or so since release. And in particular, obviously, what we talked about a lot in the last video is just that there were a lot of issues. There were a lot of things where people felt that there were a lot of quality of life features that the game should have had on launch that RuneScape has had for forever, and so on. And I also talked about how Andrew Gower was very rapidly patching in a lot of those fixes. And the reality is that I would say that basically almost all of those quality of life features are now in the game. They've basically been adding them pretty non-stop since launch, and so I cannot complain about that. One funny thing that did happen is that very recently, within like the last week or two, they did end up doing an AMA on Reddit where they answered some community questions. And in that AMA, I do have to say it was quite funny because they did express that they were quite honestly surprised that people actually cared so much about minimizing the number of clicks that they have to do to grind games, so that you have to click on things less, so that it takes fewer clicks. You can be more efficient at performing actions so that it becomes less boring when obviously you have to grind something for like 20, 30 hours at a time. It just becomes a lot more enjoyable when you know that you can do things relatively rapidly and efficiently. The other thing that they talked about that I found kind of funny in the AMA was that they basically said that they were surprised that people wanted low click intensity activities. Obviously, when you talk about RuneScape, you have this differentiation between what you call active and passive or semi-AFK methods for training. So obviously active methods involve a lot of clicking. You have to be very attentive. Maybe there's some risk that your character dies or something like that if you're not paying close attention. And so of course you need to remain attentive to the game, be clicking a lot in order to get the benefit out of an active training method. And this is obviously usually going to be faster or have some other benefits. Maybe it's more profitable or whatever, because again, you are putting more time and more effort into it. This is then opposed to your more AFK or passive methods of training, which usually have very low click density, no risk, but also give you less rewards. And so in particular, you might say, okay, I could do this mining method that is, very click intensive, gives you a lot of experience rather quickly, but then you could also do a passive method where you have to click maybe like once every couple of minutes, and that is something that a lot of people like doing in RuneScape in particular. Now, in Brighter Shores, the thing that they did was that they really made a sort of different distinction. So in Brighter Shores, there are active methods, pretty much the same as in RuneScape, but then there are completely passive methods. So the completely passive methods are, you click on it and it will just auto go, basically for about 12 to 24 hours, and there is no reason for you to click at all or come back to the game, so you can safely log out and return later. Now, I do like this. This is great because it does implement idle mechanics in games. However, I do have some issues with it as well. So the first one is that these idle methods are very, very slow in comparison to the active methods. Like we're talking maybe like 10% or 20% as fast. In comparison, when you're playing RuneScape, you might have idle methods that obviously, again, they do require some clicks, but maybe you get, say, half as much experience as you would get if you were playing more actively, something like that. So there is this huge difference where you can go completely AFK, and that is fun, that is good, but then the amount of experience that you get from it is so low that you might say, start AFKing, go to bed, sleep for 8 hours, wake up, and you don't even get the amount of experience that you would get from like 1 hour of semi-actively playing the game. So it feels like, okay, it's not really worth it. Like, you're not really getting very much out of it. So one thing that they did say in the AMA is that they were surprised that people wanted more intermediate, semi-passive methods where you are clicking, but not super frequently, similar to the way that RuneScape does things. And again, if you played a lot of RuneScape, it seems like a natural, yes, you'd expect that people would want this because a lot of them are coming from RuneScape, and that is what it is. A lot of the positives and the negatives that I've talked about in terms of the game previously still hold true, because obviously they haven't really made any huge changes to the game. There was a lot of complaints about the fact that they repeated combat skills, so there are 4 different combat skills when there only really needs to be maybe 1. And, fine, fair, totally valid. But, at the same time, it's I'll be honest, RuneScape has 4 combat skills just for melee when you only needed 1, and 2 more, obviously, for magic and ranged. There's plenty of room to complain about it, but RuneScape is guilty of this too. And they have communicated in the AMA that they are planning on making some potential changes there that they want to run by the community first before they release. They're also obviously gearing up to release the 5th chapter, the next big content patch for the game. And of course, we're looking forward to seeing what that brings. A lot of people have complained about the different chapters feeling somewhat siloed, that, basically there's not a lot of interaction between the chapters, and they've talked about addressing that in the future as well. So at this point, in terms of how long I have been playing the game, I have put about 400 hours into the game in total, looking at my Steam stats. That does obviously include times that I just left the game running but logged out, because that is something that happens. I am one of those people. Sometimes I just leave a game running for a while. So obviously not all 400 of those hours were the hours that I was playing very actively. But you may remember in my last video, I said that I felt that the game had about 200-300 hours of content, something like that. And, I was pretty happy with that for a launch. Very polished for a game of this kind. I will say that I think realistically that I probably have about 100 more hours of content before I am really done. So basically for me, the thing that I've been focusing on with my character is basically just doing all of these side quests. So you have to do a certain amount of stuff to get through all the main game quests, and then you have to level up enough to be able to do all the side quests. And I have been doing that. And I've been getting pretty close. Again, probably just 50-100 hours left before I finish that. And once I do, I will have basically finished all the content that there is in the game. For me personally, I don't care about grinding out all the skills to max currently. I'm not really interested in grinding out to 200 or 500 for all my skills or anything like that. But I do want to see all the content that the game has to offer. And so far, I like it a lot. I think that the leveling is a little bit fairer or a little bit more constant than the way that it works in RuneScape. The way that it works in RuneScape is that basically every level is exponentially a lot more experience than the previous level, which is why we have this running joke that obviously level 92 to 99 is the exact same amount of experience as going from level 1 to 92. And so, of course, that home stretch is painful for a lot of folks. The way that it works in Brighter Shores is a little bit different. So the levels do obviously increase in terms of the amount of experience per level, but the curve is a lot slower. And so what happens is there are a few breakpoints where there are huge jumps in the amount of experience required. Those breakpoints are at level 20, level 200, and of course, you max out at level 500, so there's not really a breakpoint there, it just ends, right? Conversely, again, with RuneScape, it's just exponential all the way up to 99. So the way that it works in Brighter Shores is that level 1 to 20 is relatively steady, level 20 to 200 is relatively steady, and then level 200 to 500 is relatively steady, but obviously at different levels of difficulty. And so that does mean that it's a lot easier to grind out and see consistent progress from day to day, from week to week. And it does feel a lot more, I would say, fair. There's another thing that I really do like about Brighter Shores, which is the knowledge point system. So the knowledge point system is that you have this ability where periodically you'll get a knowledge point. Those knowledge points can be used for 3 different things. They can be used for unlocking passive skill training methods, which you meet the requirements for. They can be converted to cash if you need some quick cash, or they can be spent on giving yourself experience in any skill, and it's scaled based on the level of that skill. And I actually really like that because it does mean that you have the opportunity to spend your knowledge points on skills that you don't like training so that you can level up without having to train them, which is, me personally, I like that. I like that a lot because it means that I can, basically there's a couple skills that I really don't like that I have mostly skipped entirely just by training them via knowledge points alone. I do have another complaint in terms of the repeated skills discussion, which is actually not about combat. I don't think combat is the most egregious repeated skill issue. I think probably the most annoying one for me personally is the weapon crafting skills in Chapter 3. So you get to Chapter 3, it's the chapter that's a mine. You get to mine, you get to craft weapons for your various characters. And of course, the game has 3 different classes that you can select as a part of Chapter 2. Get to Chapter 2, you get to decide what your class is. And this is another complaint I have. Right now, the classes don't really do much of anything. So basically, all you're picking is cosmetically what kinds of armor you wear, because each of the classes wear different kinds of armor, use different kinds of weapons. So yes, they're going to be changing that in the future, but it's a little annoying that it, launched with these classes that basically don't do much of anything. Now, that said, you get to Chapter 3, and there are 3 different weapon crafting skills, one for each of those professions. That, I think, is really annoying because obviously when you are playing that character, you're going to be training one skill that actually produces weapons that your character actually uses, and 2 that, basically you have no use for whatsoever. There's no point in making weapons that you can't use. Maybe there will be in the future, obviously, in terms of the ability to trade with other players and so on. But for right now, it's just like, okay, why am I bothering making a weapon that I can't use? Why am I bothering training the skill? And that's what I would say is probably my least favorite skills to train, because they're somewhat complicated and they involve producing stuff that your character may not ever use at all. Honestly, I think that what would have made sense there would have been to have made one weapon crafting skill and then just obviously make it so that you can just make the weapons that are relevant to your class. But again, can't complain too much. It's out there. It is what it is. Do I still think that the game is good? Absolutely. I enjoy playing it. Do I still think it has a lot of potential? Absolutely. What I do have to say is that, as I've talked about in my previous video, part of the problem of launching a live services game nowadays is that you basically have to be really good from the start because you are competing against every other live services game that exists. When you launch a RuneScape-like game today, you are not just competing against literally 2 different existing versions of RuneScape that are both active, you're also competing against World of Warcraft. You are competing against every first-person shooter that does live service. You're competing with everything else that might be competing for a person's time. And as a result, when you launch a live services game, you have to somewhat come out of the gate swinging, right? You have to be launching new content quickly. You have to be addressing player concerns quickly. You have to be continuing to keep that ball rolling so that it can gather some momentum and keep going, or else eventually it's going to die out. And that is the one concern that I have about this game, is that basically, yes, they did a very good job of jumping on these quality of life changes that people wanted day one and very aggressively releasing these updates. But at the same time, I would say that probably took away from energy that they were probably planning on working on content, right? And that means that we're probably going to get content somewhat delayed relative to what it would have been if all of these quality of life features had been maybe pre-planned for, or maybe if they had had a better sense of what their players would want from the start. I do think is a little bit wild, again, that they even admitted in the AMA that they didn't understand what people would want, that they didn't know what people would want. I would think that a lot of these things would have been, pretty self-evident if they had, basically gotten some people to play test it, if they had basically gotten maybe some people who played a lot of RuneScape to play test it and give them some feedback. I would have thought that a lot of these criticisms, a lot of these quality of life features that people were asking for would have been thought of sooner. And so that is the concern. I do worry that maybe they will not be able to get the ball rolling. I do worry that they maybe will not be able to get the momentum going that they are looking for, and that may end up with the game, potentially dying out. However, that said, the other important thing about modern live services games is that it's never truly dead so long as people are still playing it and so long as the lights are still on, so long as they are still paying. Which is to say that there are a lot of examples of live services games that initially had very poor launches or went in a very bad direction, but then managed to recover, managed to rebuild, and become even stronger. And I would say that obviously old school RuneScape is a classic example of this, where they forked a game off of the existing game of RuneScape and it became a much bigger hit and a lot more people liked it and it became a much bigger deal than the original RuneScape that it was branched from. So that's obviously not to say that the game is completely doomed if they don't nail this initial launch period somewhat perfectly. Obviously they can always recover and they can always keep going. And in particular, when you take something that is somewhat a passion project that people really commit to developing for a lot longer, well after launch for quite a long time, it can recover, right? It can get to a point where, maybe it's not the biggest MMO in the world, but it has a really dedicated fan base that keep the lights on. I really do hope that they are able to get to some sort of balance there. So that is all for this week's video. As always, don't hesitate to like, subscribe, smash the notification bell, comment down below, let me know what you'd like to see in future videos. Have a good week. I will see you all next week.